Hello everybody, and welcome to Mobus Creative Negotiating's 5th webinar in our 7-part webinar series on negotiating. I'm Jim Holmes, Vice President. I'm going to be one of the hosts for today, along with our CEO, Frank Mobus here.
Good morning everyone. I want to welcome all our fellow Americans as well as people from around the world. We've got some people that have signed up from Mexico, from Brazil, from the UK, and also from Israel. So welcome to you all.
Great, and if you're joining us for the first time, we're happy to have you. If you've been to some of our webinars before, welcome back. Let me take a moment now to just introduce you to our organization. We're a business-to-business training company. We specialize, obviously, in the subject of negotiation, and we offer customized instructor-led training in the form of 1- and 2-day seminars. We have half-day seminar and speech options available as well. If you would like to discuss any of those options with us, you can contact us through our website at www.mobus.com, or you can call us at 888-577-7416. So our webinar today is going to run about 40 minutes, and we're going to have a little time for questions at the end. So I just want to cover a couple of points about how the webinar will work. So during the webinar, we're going to be using a slide and video presentation. When I play a video, I'm going to turn off our mic and camera, and that's to avoid feedback to you. Not a problem with your connection. But we're also going to ask you to participate in some polls. When I launch a poll, you're going to have the opportunity to participate in the poll on your computer or tablet by clicking the options that are provided, and then I'll share the results with all of you on what the outcomes of the polls are. And if you have any questions during the webinar, you can ask them by typing them in the chat window in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. I'm the only one that will be able to see the questions, but at the end of the webinar, Frank and I will go through the list and we'll answer as many of them as we can, time permitting. So let's get started. In our last webinar, I mentioned an article that our business analyst Bill Sanders and Frank wrote for a recent article in the Supply Chain Management Review in July. The article was titled, "Rethinking the Right Way to Ink Purchasing Agreements." And it's the theme of that article that was the inspiration for this webinar today, which is, have you gotten too cozy with your negotiating partner? Well, we're going to discuss how that happens and how you can avoid the pitfalls that are presented to you when you do get too cozy. We're going to cover how it affects professional buyers and sellers, but also anybody who negotiates, especially within long-term relationships. In today's world of business, the activity of negotiating has evolved. So instead of a single negotiating approach, there are different types of negotiations that require different negotiating approaches, or what we call here at Mobus the different modes of negotiation. Now, we've covered this in previous webinars, but for those of you joining us for the first time, it bears a little quick recap. We chart negotiations along a continuum. It starts with bargaining, which is concerned with how you protect your own interests, meaning not giving away more than you have to in order to get a deal. And that starts with a pretty fundamental question, which is how much flexibility does the other person have? Now, the next mode as we move along our continuum is called creative deal making. And this is where both the objective of your negotiation and the way you're interacting with the other person changes, because you're trying to find a better deal for both sides by working in collaboration with the other party. All negotiations have an opportunity to move into this mode of negotiating. Even if you're buying a simple commodity like raw steel, you might be able to trade a price concession for them giving you a better delivery schedule or say guaranteed next day delivery. Now, the last mode of negotiating on our continuum is relationship building. And this is where your focus shifts beyond maximizing the value of the specific deal that you're working on towards working together over the long haul, where you can be involved in deep value creation and both sides negotiating can become a resource for each other. And that's going to be mostly the focus of what we're talking about today. Now, to be clear about this, we all engage in all three types of these activities. So the question is less about what kind of negotiations you actually do, but rather, where's your head at when you negotiate? Are you the kind of person who's always making sure that you get the best deal for yourself? Or are you trying to change the deal so that both sides can gain more? Or are you focused on setting up a good working relationship so you can find ongoing synergies over an extended period of time? So with that in mind, let's move to our first poll question. And the question is, when you negotiate, are you mainly a bargainer, a creative deal maker, or a strategic relationship builder? I'm going to launch the poll now and give you a chance to participate. So here goes the poll. So you can answer the question now, one of those three. We'd love to get as many of you participating as possible. We won't take too long. That's about 50%. We'll let it get up to 70. You're still voting. I'll give you a little longer. All right, so we're going to end voting now, and here's the results. So it looks like about 27% of you think that you're a bargainer, 24% a creative deal maker, and 37% a strategic relationship builder. So what Bill, Frank, and I have noticed as we have worked with top companies over the years is that business-to-business transactions are going through a rapidly growing trend. This is where people on the purchasing side are shrinking their supply base, and they're looking for strategic partners. That's the focus of our article, how to properly protect yourself when you're negotiating in long-term agreements or LTAs. And this is why we asked that first question about bargaining, creative deal making, and relationship building. The trend is moving away from basic bargaining. So what we're going to be talking about today in terms of long-term agreements is something that's happening in what we see globally in business-to-business relationships. Now, long-term agreements require negotiating in what we call the relationship building mode. So when you stop to think about it, every negotiation involves some sort of relationship. But what we mean by a negotiating relationship is that there are multiple negotiations with another person or an organization over a period of time. And those negotiations can be resolved across the continuum of negotiating modes through creative compromise, through deal making, or by hard bargaining. Now, let me ask you a question about your own negotiations. Do you have any really contentious relationships? Because if so, then you've probably gone through some negotiations that didn't go too well. Look, everybody that works in an organization is involved in relationship negotiations with your peers, your subordinates, maybe even your boss. Every meeting you attend at work is a negotiation. Now, are those organizational situations easier or more difficult to negotiate? So now we're going to ask another poll. Is it harder negotiating with people inside or outside your organization? And I will launch that poll now. And if you would participate. So inside or outside, is it harder? And we're seeing a lot of people. Give you a few more minutes, a few more seconds, that is. Great. Okay, so we're going to end the voting. So 64% of you said that it's more difficult negotiating inside your organization. You see, when you negotiate with people outside your organization, you are facing the unknown. And one of the best ways to achieve agreements in that context is through the use of discovery, because the more you know about the other person you're negotiating with, then the better you can negotiate. When you're negotiating with somebody inside your organization, well, it should be easier because you know a lot about them, but you all didn't say that. And I think that's because when you know a lot about people, it's not always good news, and risk increases. For instance, in your own organization, the risk of offense or upsetting the other person sometimes weakens your resolve in the negotiation, and then you can allow problems to fester, or worse than that, opportunities to pass you by. Frank recently shared an article with me that talked about this inside-outside concept, and I'll let him tell you about it.
Yeah, there was an article in the op-ed section of the New York Times a few weeks ago titled The Edge of the Inside. It was written by David Brooks, but the term itself comes from an unlikely source of business wisdom. There's a man named Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest from Albuquerque. Now, here's how Brooks described different ways that people try to affect change. He notes that in any organization, there are some people who serve at what you might call the core. These insiders are in the room when decisions are made. Then there are the outsiders. They throw missiles from beyond the walls. They're not really touched too much by internal loyalties, and they try to take over from without. It's almost like the true insiders are so deep inside, they often get confused by trivia and locked into the status quo, while the outsiders throwing bombs and dreaming of some kind of far-off transformational revolution. Now, before relating this concept to our topic today, which is whether or not you've gotten too cozy with your negotiating partner, I want to relate it to something of topical interest, especially right now, which is the world of politics. You may have noticed that we just finished a couple of political conventions, and in about 3 months we'll be holding an election. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is think about this for a moment. Where would you place our two candidates? As being on the inside or on the outside? Let's take a poll on this.
Great. So the poll is going to be this. How would you characterize our presidential contenders? As both insiders, both outsiders, Hillary as an insider, Donald as an outsider, or Donald as an insider and Hillary as an outsider? And I'll launch that poll now. And you can take a minute to answer that. And just a second more. Good, good, good. All right, so we'll end the voting there, and
Jim, let me ask you. Let's take the Republicans first. Where would you put Donald Trump in relation to his party? On the inside or on the outside?
Are you kidding me? Because they didn't even want to let him run for president. No, and he's never been a politician before. He's definitely on the outside.
All right. Yeah. Well, I think that's goes without saying. And how about Hillary?
Well, she's a party leader, she's held high office, she's run for president before, Secretary of State, she's the face of the Democratic Party, so yeah, she's definitely an insider.
Yeah, and I don't think we have to have a big debate about Bernie Sanders either. He wasn't even a member of the Democratic Party until it came time to run for the nomination. He had to join the party, and now I think he's switched back to being independent again. So in any case...
so let's see what the group thought here.
Right.
Let's share those results. And it looks like 68% of you thought that Hillary was an insider and Donald was an outsider.
Yeah, I think that sort of goes without saying. Yeah. So the next question then becomes how would you rate yourself? And before we do a poll on that, I want to add a little more to this profile of insiders and outsiders, which I would say are kind of like two different mental models that people have. The inside is the space that many of us are most comfortable occupying. It kind of satisfies our sense of belonging, of being simpatico. I could imagine that the neuroscientists would probably show how our brains light up when we perceive we're on the same wavelength with the other person. And this is especially when we're in a situation where we fear that conflict is a likely possibility. We seem to naturally be drawn to harmonious relationships. But that short-term gain does come at a downstream loss, which is that we often sell our own interests for the immediate peace of mind offered by a quick agreement. The outsiders occupy an entirely different space. Their desire to belong is swamped by a much stronger feeling of, I'm right and you're in the wrong. Their mental model is very often consumed with a sense that people are not only wrong, but are out to take advantage of them, and they better strike first or they'll get left with the short end of the stick. Now, how does all this relate to negotiation? How does it answer the question about whether or not you've gotten too cozy with your negotiating partner? Well, we're going to get to that shortly, but let's start with a simple negotiation. And we're going to get very basic and see what makes a deal happen. I'm going to start with this premise. A deal can only be made when there is a ZOPA, or zone of possible agreement. We have discussed this in earlier webinars. And so I want to illustrate it with a short negotiating scenario and see if we can find where the zone of possible agreement is in this upcoming video.
Okay, so I'm going to turn off the camera and sound now. Well, I see you got our proposal.
Yeah, I did. And this $2 price, that's for the 1,000,000 pounds of titanium dioxide. That's your price?
Yeah.
That's right?
Yeah, that's price. That's a good price.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good price for you, but based on the other offers, you are out of sight, man.
All right, so what price you looking for?
Based on the other quotes I'm getting, I'm looking for something closer to $1.50.
Well, I don't know who you're talking to. I mean, there's a lot of schlocky outfits out there selling sketchy material. You really want to take that risk? I mean, for the quality you want, we got the right stuff. $2 is a good price.
From the way I read the market, $1.50 is the price that you're going to have to come down to.
Well, so we see what the price range is, which is very far apart. One guy's at $2, the other guy's at $1.50. It doesn't even look like they've got the base of an agreement. But the question is, what is their ZOPA? What's the zone of possible agreement? Now, for that, we do have to go behind the scenes and see what's in each guy's head. So let's take a look at our next video.
$2 is a good price. But if I had to, I'd take $1.65.
$1.50 is the price I need you to come down to. That's the price I'd love to get. But truthfully, I need this guy's product and I'd be willing to pay a premium. $2? Maybe not, but push comes to shove, I'd take $1.85 in a heartbeat.
Okay, so there's our ZOPA. Not the range they each state at the outset, but what they sort of portrayed or revealed to us, which is their bottom line. And in other words, the space between the buyer's maximum price that he was willing to pay, which is $1.85, and the seller's minimum, $1.65. So the ZOPA, this overlap, is that 20-cent area in which the deal theoretically should be made. Now, there's different ways they can try to reach agreement and different approaches they can have. Let's see what happens when they try to negotiate from the inside. In other words, not when they try, but when they negotiate from the inside. Both sides here are trying to satisfy their sense of belonging, of being simpatico with the other side. And let's see how the negotiation then turns out.
I don't want to tick the guy off. I'd like to get more downstream business. So I think I'll give him a really nice concession right up front. How about we split the difference?
Split the diff?
Yeah, fair's fair.
Gee, I want to stay in this guy's good graces. Plus, I may need support from his organization down the line. You know what? He kind of seems like a nice guy. I hope he thinks the same of me. Okay, looks like we got a deal.
All right, 1,000,000 pounds at $1.75 a pound. I think we got a win-win here.
Yep, I think we got a win-win.
Okay, is this a solid win-win? Not really, it's just a quick agreement. Each left money on the table because neither really tested whether or not the other party had flexibility in their position. They both want to stay on the inside.
Now, wait a minute, Frank. You could say they both achieved their objectives. I mean, the buyer paid less than he thought he might have to. The seller got a higher price than he feared he might have to accept. So what's wrong with that? I mean, are these guys supposed to beat each other up where, one person, is driving the other person to their bottom line and feels like a winner, makes the other feel like a loser? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, that's not quite it, Jim. Yeah. The point is that we do live in a market economy. So ultimately, you're really not competing against the person that you're negotiating with on the other side of the table. Mm-hmm. You're really negotiating, or competing rather, against the other people that are in your marketplace. For example, in this situation, you were the buyer. Mm-hmm. Now, you're really competing against buyers from other companies. So what it means vis-a-vis this negotiation is that if you negotiate, we'll say a 5% price reduction, but other buyers in your marketplace are getting 10, 12, 15% reductions, you put your company at kind of a competitive disadvantage. Now, by the same token, let's look at the guy on the other side, Nathan, the seller. He's really competing against other account managers, other organizations, his own competitors. So if he gives, we'll say, a 15% price reduction, while other people are giving away 2 or 3% reductions, his margins will be smaller, which then means he's got less money to invest in R&D, to improve the quality of his product and build in more services. So ultimately, he's going to start losing market share.
All right, so then in terms of your inside-outside concept, that means the correct approach is to stay on the outside and to push the negotiation till you run into stiff resistance from the other party, right?
Yes, but only to a point. And this is where you've got to be careful. There are people who are pushers. In fact, the ultimate outsider will play negotiation kind of like it's a game of chicken, where they'll keep pushing the other side and hope that they blink first and then they can come in and clean up. But there's a problem with being a total outsider. And let me relate this to the group. I used to be a construction paving contractor before I got into teaching and writing on negotiation. And I once dealt with a subcontractor. He was a cement mason named Mike Zambrano. Now, he was the fiercest negotiator I ever saw. We were once doing a state job for Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, and there was this change order that came up, and Mike's was a small portion of it, but he asked me if he could come into the negotiation. He came in and he took that thing over right from the get-go. He starts off by asking for the sun and the moon, the stars, and kept pushing. He walked away from the table. He comes back, he starts pounding his fist on the table. He's really almost bullying this poor resident engineer who was just trying to keep this project on course. And he ended up getting a higher price than I would have even dreamt of starting out asking for. Now, I saw this guy, Mike, negotiate a few other times. And he won every negotiation I ever saw him get involved in until he wound up with absolutely nothing. He ticked off everybody. In other words, after a while, we stopped working with him. Other prime contractors would drop Mike because he was getting in fights on the job with people. His best workers started leaving him. Eventually, his wife even left him. Now, the funny thing about Mike was that he was a nice guy. He was very friendly, very collegial. He had a great sense of humor. But when his own interest was involved, he just took a no-prisoners approach to negotiating. Now, you can imagine what happens when two outsiders negotiate. When a guy like Mike meets his counter-image at the bargaining table, you'll often get the sparks really fly, and very often you wind up with a deadlock situation. Now, the question then is this, is we see that there's a problem with going too much on the inside, too much on the outside. What is the solution? And this is where our Franciscan priest offers some, I think, very sound advice. He says, look, you don't want to be totally on the outside or on the inside. Instead, you're better off being on the edge of the inside. Now, what characterizes these folks? These are the real change agents. You know, some of the candidates, or what I think most of us are hoping for in the candidates in the upcoming election, is that we will have some change agents in there. And the question will, time will tell whether or not that's going to happen. But the people that are operating on the edge of the inside are trying to reform the system in a fairly thorough way without completely overthrowing it. They're being sensitive to throwing out the baby with the bathwater. People on the edge of the inside operating within a company, if we relate this to business, will identify with the organization, but they don't fall prey to the old bugaboo of groupthink. As David Brooks puts it, the person on the edge of the inside has the loyalty of the faithful insider, but the judgment of the critical outsider. While the pure insider and the optimal outsider may occupy opposite ends of the pole, they do share something in common, namely in us versus them mindset, or what Brooks calls engaging in dualistic thinking. In other words, seeing problems and issues in black and white terms. The heart of being on the edge of the inside is to engage in what's called dialectical thinking, where you gain clarity by seeing both the virtues of your own ideas, but at the same time, some of the weaknesses of your own positions, or at least its contradictions, as well as appreciating the part of the other side's position that really makes sense. Now, what does that say about negotiation? It says that you're willing to push a tough negotiation, but you also recognize the dangers of pushing too hard, which you might call the Mike Zambrano syndrome, where you end up alienating the other person. And if you push the negotiation to the point that you run into resistance, but you still haven't achieved your objective, then instead of just giving in or giving up and walking away, you look for a third way, which is on the edge of the inside. And let's see how this plays out in this upcoming video.
I'm telling you, $2 is a really good price.
I'm telling you, that's more than I can afford. I just can't pay that much. I'm looking for something in the $1.50 neighborhood.
I can't do that. But I can come down a notch and make it 185 for you.
I can't do that. But I tell you what I can do. I can do 165 and I'll sign the proposal right now for you. Huh? How about that?
How about this? I make it $1.75, you pay in 10 days instead of net 30.
How about this? I'll do your 10 days for a $1.70 price and I pay the shipping because I happen to have a backhaul going right by your plant anyway.
All right, now this is what I would call a win-win deal, because each part of the deal gained extra value by shifting from bargaining into creative deal making. They're really using the inside information that they've gained over time about the needs of the other side while still making smart trade-offs to exchange terms and conditions for price concessions, which leads to a mutually beneficial agreement. Now, so let's poll you all. Where do you fit on the inside-outside of your negotiations?
Yeah, so are you operating more heavily on the inside, the outside, or the edge of the inside? And we'll launch that poll now. Let's see. And vote as quickly as you can. Let's try to get at least 80% of you participating. Inside, outside, or the edge of the inside. A couple more seconds for you to participate. And I'm gonna, some of you are thinking about it, and we're gonna end voting now. So let's share those results. It looks like 46% of you think you do work on the edge of the inside. So let me see if I can get back to my presentation here. Getting a little slow. Okay, there we go. All right, so I don't know about you guys, but I might have answered this question a little differently, and maybe some of you did as well, which is answering where I would like to fit in rather than where I actually do. So let me come clean on something here. One of my personal failings as a negotiator is working on the inside. Because I'll negotiate one-time deals, which I should do in the bargaining mode, as if I'm in the relationship building mode. For example, in the skit that we just showed, there was some history between the two negotiators, but not necessarily a long-term relationship, at least not yet. So my tendency in that situation would have been to reach for the inside, and that might have pushed me to give in too much too soon. Now, just like in our negotiating continuum, there is a continuum of negotiators, from people who are on the inside to people who are on the outside, with most people somewhere in between. And I tend towards the inside to my detriment at times. So take a good look at your own approach to negotiating. It's sometimes hard to rate yourself, but self-assessment can sometimes help you improve a little bit. What we found is that the thousands of people that have participated in our experimental negotiations that we've conducted over the past 30 years, that the majority of the people we train are prone to give in a bit too quickly. To get the deal, in other words, they want to get it over with to avoid conflict. So they tend towards the inside of the relationship with the other person. Now, there is a smaller percentage, and they are there, who not only push hard, but they're really looking at the whole entire negotiation as a contest, and they're out to win at all costs. And those are the outsiders that Brooks is mentioning in his article.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty small cohort who are willing to look for what my dad, who was a lifetime contractor and the real negotiator in our family, what he called finding the third way. And again, what we're referring to in our program here is the edge of the inside. Now, while the edge may be the optimal space to occupy from the standpoint of making better agreements, there's a very good reason why so few of us are really there. It is emotionally the most difficult place to straddle. This is because it requires holding contending ideas in tension, often for an extended period of time. And most people don't like dealing with ambiguity. There's very few of us that are comfortable playing Hamlet. It's a lot easier on us psychologically to follow the dictum of Casey Stengel. I mean, he was an old baseball manager, and his mantra was, it's either this or that, and there ain't no in between. Nobody likes Mr. In Between. It is a tough place to be. Now, that brings us to our title question, which is, have you gotten too cozy with your negotiating partner? Now, if you got a negotiating partner, you're likely in a long-term agreement, or you're dealing with a trusted or approved vendor. Let me take a moment to discuss long-term agreements, in other words, their history and the current trends surrounding them. Long-term agreements between purchasers and suppliers are not conventional one-and-done deals. They're more like moving targets that require ongoing or perpetual negotiation if they're to come close to delivering the value that inspired them in the first place. The potential values that these kinds of relationships can produce are immense. They lower transaction costs by, on the sales side, reducing the time and expense sellers have to take to hunt around for new business. And on the buying side, they cut the cost of bidding work. Plus, there's fewer supplier files and scorecards to manage. And even more important, both sides can carve out the time for the what you might call deep value creation that goes beyond total cost of ownership reduction by itself, where they can now work on joint innovation and value engineering. In a sense, it's like institutionalizing win-win. Yet the question is, how does this change the way people negotiate? We saw that in basic bargaining, both sides are competing to get the best price they can so each can stay competitive in the marketplace. To make a more creative win-win deal, they have to collaborate more. And yet, what's the right mix between the competitive and cooperative sides of negotiation? Now, let's first of all take a quick poll to see how many of you confront this in your negotiations.
Yeah, so what percentage of your business deals would you characterize as being in a long-term agreement? Let me launch that poll now. Hold on. Nope. Sorry. Forgive me. Hold on 1 second. This is poll 5. Okay. So what percentage of your business deals would you characterize as long-term agreements? Got about 38% of you, 54, try and get up to 80, 10% or less, 10 to 25%. 25 to 50, 50 to 75 or greater. All right, so we'll end the voting and we'll share the results with you. Looks like we got some people with greater than 75, but most people somewhere below that, Frank.
Yeah. I mean, I think typically a relatively small percentage of deals are long-term agreements, usually less than 50%. With some people, I've actually dealt with some organizations where it may only be 10 or 15% of their deals are these solid long-term agreements, and yet they may make up 2/3 or 3/4 of the company's overall business. So the point is that this does present a very important issue in negotiating, especially as we say today, where there's a trend now towards reducing supplier bases, and you can see it in the nomenclature that they use. When years ago, when I started out talking about negotiating, and I'd be addressing a group of salespeople, they were usually called account executives, and then the term became account managers. And more today, you see that salespeople are referred to as relationship managers. Now, one of the early movers on these long-term agreement, the LTAs, was a man some of you may be familiar with. He was known as not only the country's top quality guru, but his real main claim to fame and legend was the American who taught quality to the Japanese. His name was W. Edwards Deming. And his central premise was that an overemphasis on competition was crippling American business, especially in terms of how people negotiate. An over-adversarial approach was undermining the effectiveness of the deal. So, in any case, I was once on a panel with Deming, and I said that I agreed with the general thrust of his point, but on the other hand, how do you strike a balance between competition and cooperation in negotiation? And his quick response, and he was a kind of a gruff guy, was balance. What the hell do you want balance for? Just get rid of competition. He figured that if two companies made a long-term commitment to each other, that negotiating could become a non-conflicting activity. In fact, ultimately, he said they could get beyond negotiating at all. Now, I think the reality has come up a little short of Deming's rosy forecast. What we've found is that without constant negotiation, these golden opportunities can turn into golden handcuffs for one side or the other. Now, I found a much more, I would say, balanced view of this challenge is provided by a Nobel Prize-winning economist from Berkeley, a man named Oliver Williamson. On the one hand, Williamson does agree with Deming that LTAs can reduce transaction costs. In other words, they have a lot of benefits by reducing transaction costs, and they result in greater value creation. But I think Williamson has a much more realistic picture of the dangers that have to be guarded against. The main danger is, and I think Jim covered this in our last webinar, which, by the way, you can go to our website and see the archive version if you missed it. The main danger is what Williamson calls opportunism, where one side or both will take advantage of the other or fail to live up to the agreements they've made. Those of you that are buyers are familiar with sellers who make grand promises and then deliver a little bit less than they promised. Just-in-time delivery becomes almost in time. Lead times stretch out. Prices inch up. Joint innovation projects, which earlier generated so much enthusiasm within the supplier's organization, become weak and grow half-hearted. Now, by the same token, sellers become more vulnerable to their strategic account buyers. In other words, their business partners on the purchasing side, demanding more services than were agreed to, and the demand is backed up by the implied or sometimes the overt threat that if you don't deliver what I want, I'm going to cut you off. And this after the seller's company has taken on new overhead, maybe hired new engineering talent, and even reconfigured their production facility to accommodate this account, this strategic account. And this is where I think Deming got things somewhat backwards, and where you have to be careful with your negotiating partner. Negotiating doesn't necessarily become easier in these long-term agreements. I think it actually becomes harder, and really, in fact, not just harder, it becomes a lot harder. Because as you get cozy, you start operating almost exclusively on the inside. And it's a problem that I've talked about for a long time with procurement directors and sales VPs for major companies. Now, I don't use the term on the inside, it's commonly referred to actually as a problem of, quote unquote, going native, where after a while you start, in other words, you're the person who's interacting with your negotiating partner, and you start identifying more with the interests of that strategic partner than you do with the interests of your own organization. You kind of lose your negotiating edge, and you're no longer operating anywhere near the edge of the inside. You move totally inside the tent. I think of it like this. It does take a certain amount of energy to negotiate, where you're willing to go against the grain of what feels natural, which for most of us is to be agreeable and not make waves. Standing up for yourself, saying no, being willing to disagree with the other party, takes what I call negotiating energy. Now, as you become friendlier with the other side, and especially as you've found so many areas of mutual benefit in working together, that energy almost naturally starts to dissipate. And this makes it hard when things go wrong, when things do go wrong, to say, hold on here, we got to talk about this. Now, we see this a lot on projects like a construction job or a software development deal, where before the deal is done, both sides can be pretty aggressive. Each side may win concessions, but then once the project is underway, we move to the inside. The focus changes. The focus is really to get the thing done, and to get it done in as kind of an easy way as possible. In other words, with no argumentation. And we're no longer so concerned about protecting our own interest. We may let things slide and hope for the best because we're already in agreement on the main thrust of the deal. If the other side asks us for something small, the tendency is to say, okay, just to keep everything moving and keep everything on an even keel. Now we call these small bites that the other side is asking for, nibbling on the agreement, where one side isn't quite living up to the spirit of what was agreed to in the first place. Now the question is, if I'm the negotiator, why do I give in much easier here than I would have if they'd asked for the concessions earlier on? And I think the answer is, it's because I'm no longer on the outside at all. I'm totally on the inside, where I say to myself, look, we went through all the tension on the initial contentious negotiation to make the deal. Now we're finally on such friendly terms here. What the heck? Why hassle it? This kind of nibbling might be a relatively small thing on a standard one-off deal, but it's a major issue in a long-term agreement because these little nibbles can turn into monsters that take a major bite out of the value of the deal. So the question is, what's the best way to handle it? First of all, you got to recognize the problem, which is that there is going to be a powerful tendency to abandon your negotiating role too early on to join the party on the inside. And it's okay to go inside the tent a little ways. You know, I mean, forming a good personal relationship is a plus. But from a position on the edge of the inside. In other words, you can't forget that this is a business relationship and you got to maintain a negotiating posture. Now, I know that sounds a little abstract, so let me try to make it a little more practical. The practical application is that you want to build a framework for bringing up differences that not only are likely to crop up later, but that inevitably will come up, and if not addressed, will probably explode later on. The approach or the technique is using what I call explicit forewarning. Explicit forewarning, and what I mean by that is that as the deal is closing, and by the way, when you think about it, you've all been in deals, major deals, which have closed at one point or another. What's the atmosphere like in the room at the close of the negotiation? Generally, there's a lot of happy handshaking, slapping on the back. You know, we all kind of get in the hot tub and talk about how wonderful this partnership's going to be. You know, like happily ever after. Well, it's precisely at that point. You don't want to be nasty, but you got to be business-like about it. And you got to say to yourself, this all sounds great now, but what can go wrong later on? In other words, fight the tendency to get totally on the inside. You got to keep your eyes on the prize, which in this case is protecting the integrity of the deal for you and for them. And you can only do that by staying on the edge of the inside. And this is where the explicit forewarning comes in. And what I mean by that is to say to the other party something like this. Okay, look, everything sounds great now, and I'm really confident this deal and our relationship is going to work out well for both of us. But not everything is going to go exactly according to plan. And if you see things go wrong, I'm going to invite you to bring them to my attention, and I want to let you know that I'll be bringing up things that I see go wrong. Now, that's what I mean by building a framework for bringing up differences. Because if you say that ahead of time, then you have a much greater sense of freedom that when things do go wrong, in other words, or differences crop up, you can bring them up at that point and hash them out. Otherwise, you're trapped on the inside, and then just the thought of raising a disagreement gives you the feeling that you're almost being like a skunk at the company picnic. Then the advice is to check the progress of the deal early and often. And to do this, you do need to have a good set of milestones, like scorecard items, key performance indicators that align with your original goals. You need to keep track, and this is what we call monitoring, and make sure you're getting the performance you agreed to. And you got to do this regularly and diligently over the lifetime of the contract or the agreement. You might call it vigilance. It's another way of saying don't hope for the best, which means asking yourself, are we getting everything we bargained for? And you got to keep asking that question. Are we getting what we bargained for? Are we getting what we bargained for? And fair is fair. Are they getting what they bargained for? Meaning, are we holding up our end of the deal? Now that's what it means to be on the edge of the inside. Being able to look at the deal from your perspective and also from theirs. You have to get close to the other party to be able to do that. The danger is if you get too cozy, too far on the inside, there's a real danger that you'll lose that perspective.
All right, well, that concludes the content part of our webinar. Let's open up and see what sort of questions we've got here. Let's see. Here's one. If you're in a long-term agreement, one should be on the inside. What should one do in bargaining a one-time deal? Push hard? Do you have to stay on the outside in a bargaining deal, Frank? Well, how would you answer that?
That's a good question. I think that, you can think, just like we have a continuum from bargaining to relationship building, deal making in between. You also have I think a kind of a continuum between the inside and the outside, with this third way being kind of on a different perspective. So generally, I would say that the main danger people face in a bargaining situation, again, we define bargaining as trying to find out whether or not the other party has flexibility. So you're not leaving money on the table, you're not giving up too much too quickly. The main danger there tends to be that people are on the inside. So you want to be somewhat more on the outside. In other words, to keep challenging the other party's position without falling into the problem that Mike fell into, which is that you push so hard that you're alienating the other side. Now, I think the stronger position, though, is what we're talking about, this edge of the inside, or seeking a third way, which is that you push the deal to a point, and then you realize that if you run into resistance, there may still be value that can be captured, but it could be at the cost of alienating the other side. Then you can say, wait a second, maybe there's a different way to do this deal here, where we can find some mutual gain trade-offs.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions now which are asking how you would define a long-term agreement. And it's sort of a broad definition, but in general, any relationship, as we described it, is multiple negotiations with a person or an organization over a span of time. So a long-term agreement would be an agreement to actually do business with a particular person over a period of time. Now, there might be more than one vendor if you're a buyer that you actually are including in that, but it's that you will be one of the vendors for us over a period of time, and there would be some agreement that you have hashed out in advance that you would be referring to as you go through your series of negotiations. And one of the things we talked about last time is that those things aren't carved in stone, and that you have to recognize that you can maintain a negotiating posture in these long-term agreements, that they do evolve, and that contracts can be modified as time goes on. But a long-term agreement is basically a commitment to another person over a particular period of time to continue to do business in multiple transactions. So how do you keep a salesperson you've been buying from for years from getting too comfortable in the relationship? How do you keep your edge with someone you go to ball games with? Frank, you want to pick that up?
Yeah, well, that's the real challenge, which is that you become friendly with the other side, and then it becomes very difficult. Now, you do have to, you've got to realize that the relationship in business is first and foremost a business relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that it always has to stay 100% business. The key ingredient is whether or not you've built up trust between the two of you. That's something you only know by going through this process of having differences and seeing how open the other side is to hashing them out with you and to compromising in a way that seems fair to you. Let me give an example of somebody, exactly what you're talking about. It was somebody that I had mentioned this in an earlier webinar. It was a graphic designer that I knew in New York City, and she made deals with the printers. And so she would go, though, with the same printer on any major job. She'd go with the same printer time after time after time. And I said to her, well, how do you know that you're getting a good price? And she wouldn't even get other quotes from other printers. And she said, oh, we've been doing business with him. I know that he likes me, and he told me that he's giving me a special price. So I said, have you checked it out? Well, she didn't want to check it out because she thought if she went and got competitive bids, it was kind of like undermining their friendship. So I said to her, at one point I said to her, listen, on this job, because it's a fairly good sized job, I said, you've got to get 2 other bids. And what she found was that she was getting a special price from her buddy. She was paying 20% more than what other people were charging her. So then she had to go in and actually negotiate with the guy. So what it says is this, is that you do have to test things out. You got to test the market from time to time. And if you're finding that you're getting a fair deal, and it's not like everybody's just out to take advantage of you, what you've got is what the result of that is that you feel like now I can trust the other side. So that's what makes a long-term relationship really work well, is when you've built up mutual trust. And over time, the market becomes, and checking things out against the market becomes somewhat less important because you do have the confidence they're treating you fairly, and hopefully on your end, you're treating them fairly as well.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question here because we try to stay under an hour substantially. So anyhow, we'll just take one more question here. And this is an interesting question, is that you're basically saying that the people won't budge on pricing. One of the central principles that the question is, if there's no bargaining from a seller's perspective, meaning the seller won't budge, what can a buyer do to make a deal if the seller is sort of making you pay list cost? I think the best answer to that question is that price is not the only component of the deal, and that there are ways to get beyond that in terms of the term of the contract you're willing to commit to, in terms of a lot of the ancillary things that have to do with the deal, services that come along with it, the terms and conditions of when you pay, etc., to begin to bargain other things besides simply concessions on price. That what happens is people become very gravitationally pulled towards price as the issue, and there are other things in terms of total cost and the total value of the 2 organizations working together that may help you find some flexibility in the position of the other side.
Yeah, and let me add one thing to that, Jim, if I could, because I think that is important, that we often measure the deal and whether or not we got a good deal based on whether we get a good price, and you can move in other areas. But if they're inflexible on price, they also may be inflexible on other kinds of concessions too. And what we have not talked about, and there's only so much you can talk about in a short session, is we haven't talked about the role of power and leverage. And when you are dealing in a situation where you feel like the other party really is kind of very much outside, in other words, really looking out for themselves and not so concerned with your interests and taking advantage of, I assume that the seller here is in a strong market position, maybe even a sole source. You've got to look for, how can I build up leverage points in which I can then use that to try to get them to be more agreeable. And this is a big thing, even with a sole source. Our general point is that you usually have more power than you think. There are subtle source of power that you can bring into play to exert some kind of a negotiating posture here, so you do have a chance of putting them more on the defensive to set yourself up for getting some kinds of concessions.
Right, and that we'll sort of end on that one of the things we set up at the top was that you don't stop bargaining just because you're in a relationship. Often you do have to do that. Often you do have to use your competitive advantages in the marketplace as well. So that's something we'll think about for another webinar, which has to do with sole sources and favored nations contracts, where people are saying there's no way I can move on price. But we want to thank you so much for joining us for another webinar. Please call us if you're interested in having us come in to do a customized seminar for you, a 1 or a 2-day, a speech, a half-day seminar. We'd love to come and help your people improve their negotiating skills. And make sure you go to our website. We have some negotiating games there. We can put you on our list for a newsletter, etc. So thanks so much for coming, and we'll see you next time. All right. Have a nice day, everybody.